Today, I'd like to share with you the story of Catherine and James, two souls whose love burned so intensely at 19 that it left permanent marks, even after 35 years of separation. Catherine was 54 when she found the letters in her mother's attic. Dozens of them, tied with faded ribbon, written in handwriting she'd recognize anywhere. James Monroe, her first love. The man who'd written her words so beautiful and explicit they still made her blush decades later, who'd touched her like she was sacred, who'd loved her so completely she'd never quite figured out how to stop loving him back. What happened when she decided to reach out to him after 3.5 decades, when she discovered whether passion that intense could survive the weight of time and distance, is a story about desire that doesn't fade, about bodies that remember what minds try to forget, and about the kind of love that refuses to stay buried no matter how many years pass. I invite you to subscribe to our channel, and please, share in the comments where you're listening from today. I love knowing where our stories travel. Catherine Hayes was 54 years old when she found the letters, though finding suggested accident, and this discovery felt more like fate finally deciding to stop being cruel. She'd been searching the attic of her childhood home in Charleston, South Carolina for her mother's wedding china, something her daughter wanted for her own upcoming wedding, when her hand brushed against a wooden box she didn't remember, tucked behind insulation in a corner that seemed designed to hide secrets. The August heat made the attic oppressive, sweat trickling down her spine, her hair sticking to her neck in ways that reminded her she wasn't the girl she'd been when these letters were written. But when she opened the box and saw the envelopes, saw the handwriting she'd recognize anywhere even after 35 years, even blind, even in darkness, her breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the stifling air, and everything to do with memory suddenly becoming present, becoming visceral, becoming something that lived in her body rather than just her mind. The letters were tied with a ribbon that had once been red but had faded to dusty rose, and there were so many of them, dozens, maybe more than 100, spanning 3 years of her life when she'd been young enough to believe love conquered everything and naive enough to think passion like theirs was common. That everyone felt this way, this consuming need to possess and be possessed, to know and be known so completely that separate bodies felt like a cosmic mistake. Catherine sat down right there on the attic floor, dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the small window, and pulled the first letter from its envelope with hands that trembled in ways that embarrassed her. She was a grown woman, a widow of 7 years, a mother of 2, a grandmother of 1 with another on the way. She'd lived an entire life since these letters were written, had loved her husband genuinely, if not with the same fierce intensity, had built a career as a literature professor, had experienced joy and grief, and all the complicated emotions that came with decades of living. But holding this letter, seeing his handwriting forming her name, Catherine, just Catherine, the way he'd always said it, like her name was a prayer or a promise or both, she felt 19 again, felt her body remember things her mind had carefully archived away. The letter was dated July 1988, written during the first summer they'd been apart, when she'd gone home to Charleston for the break, and he'd stayed in Boston for an internship. They'd met as freshmen at Boston University, had fallen into each other with the kind of intensity that terrified their friends and probably should have terrified them, but they'd been too consumed by each other to care about warnings or concern, or the well-meaning suggestions that maybe they should slow down, take it easy, not invest so heavily so young. His name was James Monroe, though she'd always called him Jamie in her head. Never out loud because he'd told her once he hated nicknames, that his name was the only thing his father had given him before leaving, and he wanted it used in full. But in her private thoughts, in the intimate space of her own mind, he'd been Jamie, softer, more accessible, hers in ways the formal James could never quite be. She read the first letter slowly, savoring each word like they were water, and she'd been wandering a desert for 35 years without realizing how thirsty she'd been. His handwriting was neat, precise, the product of a mother who'd insisted on penmanship, even in an age when computers were becoming ubiquitous. and his words were both eloquent and raw in ways that made her chest ache with how much she'd forgotten, how much she'd forced herself to forget, because remembering had been too painful. He wrote about missing her in ways that were both poetic and explicitly physical, describing how he woke reaching for her, how his bed felt enormous and empty without her body curved against his, how he'd stand under cold showers trying to calm the constant state of arousal that came from remembering her skin, her mouth, the sounds she made when he touched her in the ways only he knew made her come apart. The letter was beautiful and obscene in equal measure, the kind of thing that would make her blush now if anyone else read it. But that had made her 19-year-old self feel powerful, desired, essential in ways she'd never experienced before or since. But more than the physical longing, he wrote about missing the conversations, the way she saw the world through a lens of literature and beauty that made everything more vivid. How talking to her made him understand things he'd been thinking, but couldn't articulate until she gave him the vocabulary. He wrote about loving her in ways that transcended the physical, though the physical was intoxicated and consuming, and so intense he sometimes couldn't think straight when she was near. He wrote about a future he imagined for them, vague and idealistic but utterly certain, as if their ending up together was as inevitable as sunrise, as natural as breathing. Catherine set the letter down with shaking hands and reached for the next one, then the next, losing track of time as she read through the summer of 1988, watching their love story unspool in his handwriting and her responses. She'd apparently saved both sides of the correspondence, his letters to her and copies she'd made of her own letters to him, the kind of thorough documentation that suggested even then some part of her had known this was important, was worth preserving, was the kind of love people wrote novels about. Her letters were just as intense as his, just as explicit in their longing, just as certain in their declarations of forever. She'd written about her body's memory of his hands, about lying in her childhood bed, touching herself, while imagining it was him, about the way anticipation of seeing him again made her feel like she was vibrating at a frequency slightly different from everyone around her, existing in a state of heightened awareness that made everything more intense. But she'd also written about literature and philosophy, about books she was reading and thoughts they inspired, about the way certain passages made her think of him, made her want to read them aloud, with her head on his chest, so she could feel the vibration of his voice in her bones. She'd written about dreams and fears, and the particular terror of loving someone this much, of needing someone in ways that felt both exhilarating and dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you might fall but being unable to step back from the precipice. The letters from their second summer apart, 1989, were more desperate, more raw, as if the separation had worn them down, made them less careful about propriety or poetry, and more focused on the aching need to be together. James wrote about dreams where he could taste her, about waking hard and frustrated and angry at the distance between them, about counting days and hours until he could see her again. Catherine had written back matching his intensity, describing physical sensations in such explicit detail that reading them now made her face flush with heat that had nothing to do with the attic temperature. But woven through the physical longing was something deeper, something that made the letters more than just erotic correspondence between young lovers. They wrote about seeing each other, really seeing, in ways that felt rare and precious. James wrote about how Catherine noticed beauty in things other people overlooked, how she could find meaning in the mundane, how talking to her made him feel more intelligent, more capable, more himself than he'd ever felt alone. Catherine wrote about how James made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable, how he held space for all her contradictions, her strength and her fragility, her confidence and her insecurities, her dreams and her fears, without trying to resolve them or fix them or make her smaller to be more comfortable. The third summer, 1990, the letters changed tone. They were still passionate, still explicit, still full of longing that bordered on obsession, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty creeping in. Questions about what came after graduation, about how they would build a life together when his family was in Boston and hers in Charleston, when his career ambitions pointed toward finance in New York, and hers toward academia, which could be anywhere or nowhere depending on where she could find work. James wrote about wanting to marry her, about being certain she was the person he wanted to spend his life with, but also about the practicalities of timing, of waiting until they were established, of making sure they could support themselves before taking on the legal and financial responsibilities of marriage. Catherine had written back agreeing, but with a thread of anxiety running through her agreement. Questions about whether waiting meant their certainty might fade, whether the intensity that bound them together required proximity to survive, whether love like theirs could weather the mundane reality of bills and jobs and all the ordinary pressures that came with adult life. And then, 3/4 of the way through the box, the letters stopped. Just stopped, mid-conversation, mid-correspondence, as if someone had severed the connection with surgical precision. The last letter was from James, dated October 1990, their senior year, and it was different from all the others. Shorter, more formal, less explicitly physical, though no less intense in its own way. He wrote about loving her, about that never changing, about her being essential to who he was. But he also wrote about his mother's illness, cancer, sudden and aggressive, about needing to stay in Boston, about the impossibility of asking Catherine to give up her dreams to follow him when his future had become so uncertain. He'd written about letting her go, about loving her enough to free her from obligation, about wanting her to have all the beautiful things she deserved, without being tied to someone whose life had suddenly become complicated in ways that felt insurmountable. He'd written about how she should forget him, move on, find someone who could give her the life she dreamed of without compromise or sacrifice. And he'd ended with words that even 35 years later made Catherine's eyes sting with tears. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will love you until my last breath leaves my body. But loving you means letting you go." Catherine sat in the attic, surrounded by letters, her face wet with tears she hadn't realized she was crying, her heart pounding with a mixture of grief and rage and longing that felt as fresh as if this had happened yesterday, rather than 3.5 decades ago. She'd received that letter in October 1990, had tried to call him, to argue, to tell him she didn't want to be let go, that she'd rather struggle together than succeed apart. But he hadn't answered, had apparently blocked her number, had disappeared from her life with the same intensity he'd occupied it. She'd been devastated, had spent months in a fog of grief and confusion, unable to understand how love that intense could simply end, how someone could claim to love you, and then cut you out of their life completely. Her friends had told her he'd done her a favor, that she was young and would find someone else, that first loves were meant to teach you about love, but not necessarily to last forever. And eventually she'd moved on. Met David in graduate school, married him, built a life that was good and stable, and had brought her children she adored, and a career she found meaningful. But she'd never forgotten James, had never stopped wondering what happened to him, how his mother's illness resolved, whether he'd found happiness, whether he ever thought about her the way she sometimes, in quiet moments, thought about him, with a mixture of fondness and regret, and the particular ache that came from knowing someone intimately and then losing them completely. And now, sitting in her mother's attic with August heat pressing down and letters scattered around her like fallen leaves, Catherine understood something she'd never quite articulated before. She'd loved David, genuinely loved him, but it had been a different kind of love, comfortable, steady, built on friendship and mutual respect rather than consuming passion. What she'd had with James had been something else entirely, something that burned so hot it had probably been unsustainable, but that had marked her permanently, had set a standard against which everything else was measured and found wanting. She looked at her phone, at the time, showing it was after 6, that she'd been in the attic for 4 hours, that her daughter was probably wondering where she was with the china. But Catherine couldn't bring herself to care about dishes or weddings or any of the mundane concerns that had occupied her attention before she opened this box. Because sitting there, reading these letters, feeling the full weight of what she and James had shared come crashing back over her, She realized something both terrible and exhilarating. She'd spent 35 years convinced she'd moved on, convinced the love she'd felt for James had been youthful intensity that couldn't have survived real life, convinced she'd built something better and more sustainable with David. But the truth she could no longer avoid as she sat surrounded by evidence of passion she'd never quite replicated, was simpler and more painful. She'd never stopped loving James Monroe. She'd just gotten very, very good at pretending she had. The box held more than letters, she realized, digging deeper. There were photographs, the two of them together, young and beautiful, and so clearly consumed by each other that the camera had captured it, that visible energy between them that made other people in photos look like background scenery. There was a t-shirt of his she'd kept, faded now, the cologne he'd worn long since dissipated, but her memory supplying the scent anyway. There were ticket stubs from movies and concerts, receipts from restaurants, all the ephemera of a relationship lived intensely in the moment, documented carefully for a future that never came. At the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, Catherine found something that made her breath catch more sharply than anything else had. A small jewelry box, the kind that held rings, and inside it, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, an engagement ring. Simple, elegant, a single diamond on a platinum band, and tucked underneath it, a note in James's handwriting. For when we're ready, I love you, C, always, J. He'd bought her a ring, had been planning to propose, and then his mother had gotten sick and he'd pushed her away instead. Had made the decision for both of them that separation was better than struggling together. Had loved her enough to let her go, but apparently not enough to trust her to make her own choice about whether to stay. Catherine closed the box carefully, her hands steadier now, the initial shock of discovery settling into something more manageable, more focused. She climbed down from the attic, the box tucked under her arm, and walked to her old bedroom where she'd been staying while helping her mother sort through decades of accumulated possessions. She set the box on the desk by the window, opened her laptop, and did something she'd told herself for 35 years she wouldn't do. She searched for James Monroe, Boston, finance, and held her breath while results loaded, terrified and hopeful in equal measure, not sure whether finding him would make everything better or infinitely worse. Knowing only that after reading those letters, after feeling the full force of what they'd shared come rushing back, she couldn't not know. Couldn't spend the rest of her life wondering. Couldn't let this story end with that October letter and 3.5 decades of silence. The search results loaded, and Catherine stared at the screen, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy with it, seeing a name and face that had haunted her dreams for 35 years, discovering that some stories, no matter how thoroughly you think they've ended, might not be over after all. James Monroe existed, not just in memory or in letters yellowed with age, but in the actual, present-tense world Catherine inhabited. The search results showed a professional profile with a photograph that made her hands go numb. Older, grayer, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she knew him, but unmistakably, devastatingly him. The same strong jaw, the same serious expression that had always softened when he looked at her, the same intensity in his eyes that had made her feel like the only person in any room they occupied together. He lived in Boston still, worked as a senior partner at an investment firm, had apparently never left the city where they'd met, and fallen in love with such consuming ferocity. The photograph showed him at some professional event, wearing a suit that fit him well, looking successful and distinguished and exactly like someone who'd spent 35 years building a career in finance. But Catherine found herself searching the image for signs of the boy she'd known, the one who'd written her letters so explicit they'd made her blush, who'd touched her like she was something precious and profane simultaneously, who'd looked at her with such naked need it had made her feel powerful in ways she'd never experienced before or since. His profile was sparse on personal details, professional achievements taking up most of the space, but there was one detail that made Catherine's breath catch. No mention of a wife, no family photographs in the background of his professional photo. Nothing to suggest he'd married and built the kind of conventional life she'd imagined for him during the years of not searching, of deliberately not looking, because looking would have hurt too much. She spent the next 3 hours falling down a research rabbit hole, finding mentions of him in business articles, photographs from charity events where he stood alone or with colleagues, but never with a woman who seemed significant, building a picture of a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt somehow incomplete. Or maybe she was projecting, seeing in his solitary professional existence a mirror of her own emotional isolation, the way she'd been married but never quite fully present, always holding something back, some part of herself that had belonged to James and had never quite transferred its allegiance despite her best efforts. Charleston's humid night pressed against the windows as Catherine sat at the desk in her childhood bedroom, the box of letters beside her laptop, feeling like she existed in 2 timelines simultaneously, the present where she was a 54-year-old widow and grandmother, and the past where she was 19 and so consumed by love, it felt like a physical force, something that could be measured and weighed, something that took up space in the world beyond just the bodies experiencing it. She opened the letters again, this time reading not chronologically, but searching for specific ones, the most explicit, the most passionate, wanting to remember in detail what they'd been to each other. One letter in particular, from August 1989, made her entire body flush with heat that had nothing to do with Charleston's oppressive humidity. James had written it after their first time sleeping together following that summer apart, describing in minute detail everything he remembered about her body, everything he'd done to her, everything he wanted to do again. His words were poetic and pornographic in equal measure, describing her skin like it was landscape he needed to map with his hands and mouth, her pleasure like it was music he was learning to conduct, her body like it was territory he needed to claim and worship simultaneously. He'd written about the sounds she made, about how hearing her come undone had become his favorite symphony, about how watching her face in the moment of climax had felt like witnessing something sacred, something he was privileged to see, something that made him understand religion in ways philosophy never had. But beyond the explicit physical descriptions, he'd written about connection, about the way making love to her felt less like 2 separate bodies joining, and more like one consciousness experiencing itself through 2 perspectives, about how he'd never understood why people made distinctions between physical and emotional intimacy, because with her, they were inseparable, the same thing expressed through different channels. He'd written about loving her with his body, the way he loved her with his mind, with his heart, with whatever essential part of him existed beyond the physical, about how sex with her was just another language for saying what he felt, another way of expressing something too big and complex for just words. Reading it now, decades later, Catherine felt that same swooping sensation in her stomach she'd felt at 19, that mixture of arousal and emotion that made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. No one had ever written to her like that again. David had been affectionate, had said he loved her regularly, had been a considerate lover in bed. But there had been nothing of this intensity, this need to document and express and make permanent through words what they experienced in flesh. She found her own letter responding to his, written in her 19-year-old handwriting that was rounder, less controlled than her adult script. She'd matched his explicitness, describing what it felt like when he touched her, how her body responded to him in ways that felt almost embarrassing in their intensity, how she'd never known pleasure could be so overwhelming it bordered on pain, how she sometimes had to ask him to stop not because it didn't feel good, but because it felt too good, like her nervous system might short-circuit from sensory overload. But she'd also written about trust, about how she'd never felt safe enough with anyone else to completely let go, to be vulnerable in the ways required for that level of intimacy, about how loving him had taught her that her body was capable of things she'd never imagined, responses she'd thought were exaggerated in books and movies, but turned out to be real, to be possible when the connection was right and deep and true. Catherine set the letters down and stood up, pacing the small bedroom with restless energy, her body humming with memories and desire and a longing that felt inappropriate for a woman her age but was undeniable in its intensity. She'd convinced herself for 35 years that what she and James had shared was youthful intensity that couldn't have lasted, that the sexual chemistry would have faded into something more manageable, that real adult love was supposed to be calmer, steadier, less consuming. But reading these letters, feeling her body's visceral response to words written decades ago, Catherine understood something she'd been avoiding. What she and James had wasn't just youthful passion destined to burn out. It was the real thing, the kind of love people spent lifetimes searching for, the kind that most people never found, because it required a specific alchemy of physical attraction and emotional connection, and intellectual compatibility that was rare enough to be nearly impossible. And she'd lost it. Or rather, James had taken it away from her, had made the decision that his mother's illness meant they couldn't be together, had chosen noble suffering over potentially messy togetherness. The unfairness of it hit Catherine with fresh force. She'd never gotten to choose, never gotten to decide whether she was willing to struggle through his mother's cancer with him, never gotten to prove that love like theirs could survive hardship. He'd simply decided for both of them that separation was kinder than difficulty, and she'd spent 35 years living with the consequences of a choice she'd never agreed to. Charleston's church bells chimed midnight, and Catherine realized she'd been sitting with these letters for 6 hours, that the entire evening had passed in a haze of memory and longing, that her daughter had texted 3 times asking if she was okay, and she hadn't even noticed. She sent a quick reply. "Fine, just tired. See you tomorrow." And then did something that felt simultaneously insane and inevitable. She created a new email account, something anonymous enough to not immediately identify her, but personal enough to not seem like spam. And then, before courage could fail her, before rational thought could intervene with all the reasonable arguments against contacting someone from 35 years ago, she began typing. The email took her 2 hours to write, delete, rewrite, revise. She told him who she was, as if he could have forgotten, as if Catherine Hayes wasn't burned into his memory the way James Monroe was burned into hers. She told him about finding the letters, about reading them and feeling everything come rushing back, about realizing that some loves don't fade just because time passes. They just go underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface and remind you what you lost. She told him about David, about her marriage and widowhood, being honest about having loved her husband, while also being clear it had been different, calmer, less all-consuming. She told him about her children and grandchild, about her career teaching literature, about the life she'd built that was good and meaningful, but had always felt like it was missing something essential, some vital ingredient she'd lost when he'd pushed her away. But mostly, she told him the truth she'd discovered sitting in that attic surrounded by evidence of passion she'd never quite replicated. She told him she'd never stopped loving him, that every man she'd been with had been measured against him, and found wanting not because they were inadequate but because they weren't him, because what they'd shared had been singular and irreplaceable, and she'd been foolish to think she could find it again with someone else. She told him about the ring she'd found, about the proposal that never happened, about how discovering he'd been planning a future with her made the loss feel fresh rather than ancient, made her angry in ways she'd thought she'd processed decades ago. She asked him about his mother, whether she'd survived, whether his sacrifice had been worth it, whether he'd found happiness, or at least contentment in the life he'd built without her. And then, in the closing paragraph, Catherine wrote something that made her hands shake as she typed it. She told him that if he'd ever wondered whether what they had could have survived, whether the intensity would have faded into something more manageable, or whether it was the kind of love that only exists in youth and memory, she had an answer. She told him that reading those letters had made her body respond like she was 19 again, that the desire hadn't faded, that whatever had existed between them was apparently resilient enough to survive 35 years of separation, and still burn hot enough to make her feel reckless and desperate, and willing to risk the comfortable life she'd built for the chance to see if what they'd had was real or just memory gilded by nostalgia and regret. She ended by giving him her phone number, her real email, an invitation to contact her if he felt any of what she was feeling. if reading this email stirred up anything resembling the chaos currently consuming her entire being. And then, before she could second-guess or delete or talk herself out of it, she hit send and watched the email disappear into the digital void, carrying with it everything she'd been holding inside for 35 years. The response came 17 minutes later. Catherine had been pacing her bedroom, alternating between regret and hope, convinced he'd either ignore the email or respond with polite distance, telling her he was married with children, that he'd moved on completely, that the past was best left in the past. But when her phone chimed with a new email notification, when she saw the sender was James Monroe, her heart stopped entirely before starting again at triple speed. His email was direct, vulnerable in ways that made her chest ache. He wrote that he'd been staring at his computer screen for 15 minutes, trying to figure out what to say, how to compress 35 years of thinking about her, missing her, regretting his decision into something that fit into an email. He wrote that her message had hit him like a physical blow, that he'd thought he'd successfully buried his feelings under decades of work and routine and careful avoidance of anything that reminded him of what he'd lost. He wrote that he'd never married, had never even come close, that every relationship he'd attempted had felt like a betrayal of what they'd shared, like settling for approximation when he'd once had the real thing. He wrote that his mother had survived, 20 more years before dying peacefully, and that he'd spent most of those years wondering if his decision had been protection or cowardice, whether loving someone really meant setting them free, or whether it meant fighting to keep them regardless of circumstances. And then he wrote something that made Catherine sit down hard on her bed, her vision blurring with tears. He wrote that he still had every letter she'd ever sent him, that they were in a box in his closet in Boston, that he'd read them more times than he could count over the years, that her words had been his company through every lonely night, every failed relationship, every moment when he'd wondered what his life might have looked like if he'd been brave enough to ask her to stay, instead of noble enough to let her go. He wrote that seeing her name in his inbox had made him feel 19 again, had brought back every sensation, every memory, every moment of wanting her so intensely it felt like his skin was too small to contain everything he felt. He wrote that if she was serious about seeing whether what they'd had could exist in present tense rather than just past, he wanted to try, that he'd been half alive for 35 years, and the possibility of being whole again, even if it ended in disappointment, was worth any risk. His final line was simple, devastating in its directness. "When can I see you?" Catherine read the email 3 times, her hands trembling, her entire body alive with possibility and terror in equal measure. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, could feel desire and fear and hope tangling together into something that made her feel more present, more alive than she'd felt in decades. James wanted to see her. James had never stopped loving her. James had been waiting too, carrying the same burden of what if and might have been that she'd been carrying. She typed her response with shaking fingers, her usual eloquence deserting her in favor of raw honesty. She told him she could come to Boston, that her daughter's wedding wasn't for another month, that she could leave Charleston whenever he wanted to see her. She told him she was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, that she had no idea what they were doing or whether it was wise, but that wisdom felt less important than finally finding out if the love that had defined her entire life was something that could be resurrected, or if it existed only in letters and memory. His response came almost immediately. "Tomorrow. Come tomorrow. I'll send you my address. Catherine, I can't wait another day. I've already waited 35 years too long." And just like that, sitting in her childhood bedroom in Charleston with August humidity pressing against the windows and a box of love letters scattered around her, Catherine's carefully constructed life shifted on its axis. Tomorrow, she would see James Monroe again. Tomorrow, she would find out if bodies that had once known each other intimately could remember after decades apart. Tomorrow, she would discover whether love that had burned so bright at 19 could be rekindled at 54, or whether some fires, once extinguished, were meant to stay that way. She lay in bed that night unable to sleep, her body humming with anticipation that felt exactly like it had 35 years ago, waiting for summer to end so she could see him again. Some things, apparently, didn't change with age. The way desire made sleep impossible. The way hope and fear tangled together until you couldn't tell which emotion was stronger. The way love, real love, the kind that marked you permanently, could make you feel 19, even when your body and circumstances insisted you were anything but. Tomorrow. She would see him tomorrow, and whatever happened after that, joy or heartbreak, fulfillment or disappointment, at least she would finally know. At least she would have tried. At least the story that had ended so abruptly 35 years ago would get a chance at a different ending. One they chose together, rather than one James decided for them both. Catherine clutched his last letter to her chest and finally fell asleep as Charleston's church bells marked 3 a.m, dreaming of Boston and reunion and the terrifying possibility that some loves really were worth waiting half a lifetime for. The flight to Boston felt both endless and impossibly short, time behaving strangely the way it does when you're moving toward something that might change everything. Catherine sat in her window seat watching clouds pass beneath the plane, her carry-on containing nothing practical, just the box of letters, a change of clothes, and the kind of nervous energy that made sitting still feel like torture. She told her daughter she needed to handle some business in Boston. A vague explanation that wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't the truth either. Because how did you explain to your adult child that you were flying across the country to see if a love from 35 years ago could be resurrected? She'd spent 2 hours that morning choosing what to wear, her bedroom floor covered with discarded options, feeling ridiculous for caring so much about appearance when what they were really testing was whether the essential connection between them had survived decades of separation. But she cared anyway, settling finally on a simple navy dress that was elegant without trying too hard, that skimmed her 54-year-old body in ways that were flattering without being desperate, that made her feel like herself. Older, yes, changed by time and experience, but still fundamentally Catherine. James had sent his address along with an invitation to come straight to his apartment from the airport, not suggesting they meet in a neutral public place first, apparently as unwilling as she was to waste time on cautious preliminaries when they'd already wasted so much time being apart. The address was in Back Bay, one of Boston's elegant neighborhoods, and Catherine found herself wondering what his home looked like, whether it reflected the boy she'd known or the man he'd become, whether she'd see traces of their shared past in his present, or whether he'd buried it all the way she'd tried to. The taxi from Logan Airport moved through Boston's familiar streets, and Catherine felt memory and present colliding in disorienting ways. She'd lived in this city for 4 years, had walked these streets with James countless times, had built a geography of intimacy that included favorite restaurants and quiet corners and places they'd kissed when they should have been studying. But the city had changed. Buildings replaced. Businesses transformed. The landscape of youth overlaid with the reality of decades passing, everything familiar and foreign simultaneously. His building was beautiful in that understated way that suggested old money and careful maintenance, brick and ornate ironwork, the kind of place that had probably been elegant for 100 years and would be elegant for 100 more. Catherine stood on the sidewalk looking up at it, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy, trying to summon the courage to walk inside, to take the elevator to the 4th floor, to knock on the door and face whatever came next. She'd been brave once, at 19, when bravery had come easily because she'd had nothing to lose. But 54 came with the weight of experience, with the knowledge of how badly things could hurt when they ended, with the accumulated scar tissue of a life lived carefully, because being reckless had consequences that lasted decades. Standing there on that Boston sidewalk, Catherine had to choose, safety or possibility, protection or risk, the comfortable loneliness she'd learned to live with, or the terrifying chance that she might get to feel alive again. She chose possibility, chose risk, chose the terrifying chance. Because what was the alternative? Flying back to Charleston having never known whether the letters were just beautiful lies or whether they'd documented something real enough to survive 35 years of separation. The elevator ride to the 4th floor took forever, and no time at all. Catherine watched the numbers climb. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her reflection in the polished brass doors showing a woman who looked nervous and hopeful and scared in equal measure. The doors opened onto a hallway with only 2 apartments, and she walked to the one on the right, the number matching what James had sent her, her hand trembling as she raised it to knock. The door opened before her knuckles made contact, as if he'd been standing there waiting, as if he'd heard the elevator and known it was her, as if he'd been as unable to wait patiently as she'd been unable to walk slowly. And then James was standing in front of her, real and solid and present in ways that photographs couldn't capture, and Catherine forgot how to breathe. He'd aged, obviously, inevitably, but in ways that had only added to, rather than diminished from. His hair was silver gray now, still thick, but no longer the dark brown she remembered. Lines bracketed his mouth and fanned from his eyes, evidence of decades of expressions, of life lived. He was broader than he'd been at 22, filled out in the way men do when youth gives way to middle age. And he wore casual clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, that suggested he'd been as uncertain about what to wear as she'd been. But his eyes were exactly as she remembered, that particular shade of hazel that shifted between green and gold depending on the light, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her skin flush with heat that had nothing to do with Boston's September weather. He was looking at her like she was water, and he'd been wandering a desert, like she was air, and he'd been holding his breath, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for 35 years. They stood there in his doorway for a moment that stretched, neither speaking, both simply looking, trying to reconcile memory with present reality, searching each other's faces for traces of who they'd been while also taking in who they'd become. Catherine saw the boy she'd loved in the man standing before her. Same serious expression, same way of holding himself, same essential quality that made him uniquely James. But she also saw a stranger, someone who'd lived an entire life she knew nothing about, who carried experiences and losses and joys that had shaped him in ways she couldn't know just from looking. And then James said her name, Catherine, and his voice was deeper than she remembered, but held the same note of reverence it had always held when he spoke to her. Like her name was something sacred, something to be handled carefully. And whatever carefully maintained distance Catherine had been trying to preserve shattered completely. She wasn't sure who moved first, whether she stepped forward or he pulled her in, but suddenly she was in his arms, and he was holding her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. And she was holding him back just as tightly, her face pressed against his chest, breathing in a scent that was different from what she remembered. Different cologne, different laundry detergent. But underneath it all, something that was fundamentally him, something her body recognized even if her mind couldn't name it. They stood like that in his doorway for long minutes, just holding each other, both trembling with emotion that was too big and complex to name. Relief and grief and joy and regret, all tangled together into something that felt like coming home after being lost for 35 years. Catherine felt tears on her face and realized she was crying, felt James's chest shaking, and realized he was crying too, both of them mourning and celebrating simultaneously, acknowledging all the time they'd lost, while also being grateful for this moment of reunion. When they finally pulled apart, both with wet faces and shaky laughs at their emotional display, James pulled her fully into his apartment and closed the door, creating privacy for whatever came next. His home was beautiful in an understated way. Hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, furniture that was elegant and comfortable, windows overlooking a tree-lined street. But Catherine barely registered the details because James was looking at her again with that same intensity, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs wiping away tears while his own still tracked down his cheeks. He told her she was beautiful, more beautiful than his memory had managed to preserve. That time had only added depth to features that had already been perfect. Catherine laughed, a sound caught between sob and genuine amusement, and told him he was either lying or blind, that she was 54 and looked it, that her body bore the evidence of decades and gravity and 2 pregnancies. But James shook his head, his hand still cradling her face, and told her she'd never looked more beautiful to him than she did right now, real and present and finally in front of him again. And then, because apparently some things transcended time and age and 35 years of separation, because apparently bodies remembered even when minds tried to forget, James kissed her. It started gentle, almost tentative, both of them nervous and uncertain, despite the passion burning between them, both aware they were different people than they'd been, that bodies changed, that assuming the chemistry would be the same was perhaps naive. But gentle lasted approximately 3 seconds before muscle memory kicked in, before Catherine's body remembered this mouth, this taste, this particular way James kissed that was uniquely his, thorough and possessive and somehow both demanding and worshipful simultaneously. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, needing more contact, more pressure, more everything. His hands slid from her face to her hair, tangling in it the way he'd always done, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, and Catherine made a sound that would have embarrassed her if she'd had any capacity for embarrassment left. But she didn't, couldn't, was too consumed by sensation, by the way her entire body was lighting up like neural pathways that had been dormant for decades were suddenly firing all at once. This was what she'd been missing. This specific chemistry, this particular alchemy of his mouth on hers, his hands in her hair, his body pressed against hers. She'd kissed David thousands of times over their marriage, had enjoyed it, had felt affection and warmth. But it had never been this consuming need, this feeling like if he stopped kissing her, she might actually die. This sense that her body was made specifically to fit against his, and every moment spent apart from him was time wasted. They broke apart gasping, both breathing hard, and James rested his forehead against hers, his hands still in her hair, both of them trembling with desire and emotion in equal measure. He told her he'd been terrified the chemistry would be gone, that it would have been something that only existed in youth and memory, that they'd kiss and feel nothing but awkwardness and disappointment. But it wasn't gone, was it? It was right there, as powerful as ever. Maybe more powerful, because they understood now how rare this was, how most people never experienced this level of connection, how they'd been stupid to let it go. Catherine agreed, her voice rough with want, telling him that reading his letters had prepared her intellectually for the possibility that the desire might still exist, but nothing could have prepared her for the physical reality of it, for how her body responded to him like no time had passed at all, like 35 years of separation had been just a pause, rather than an ending. James pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes dark with desire, but also asking a question, seeking permission for what they both knew came next if they didn't stop now. And Catherine, who'd been careful for so long, who'd built a life around measured responses and appropriate behavior, who'd convinced herself she was too old for this kind of consuming passion, answered by kissing him again, by pulling him toward what she assumed was his bedroom, by choosing want over wisdom, desire over caution, the terrifying possibility of complete connection over the safety of holding back. His bedroom was sun-filled and elegant, but Catherine registered it only in flashes between kisses, a large bed, floor-to-ceiling windows, an armchair in the corner. They undressed each other slowly, despite the urgency thrumming through both of them, taking time to look, to touch, to acknowledge how bodies had changed while also appreciating how they'd stayed essentially the same. Catherine's body bore the evidence of living. Stretch marks from pregnancies, skin less firm than it had been at 19, breasts that gravity had affected, the general softening that came with decades. But James touched her like she was precious, like every mark and scar was beautiful. Like her 54-year-old body was even more desirable than her 19-year-old body had been, because it carried evidence of life lived, of experiences survived, of time passing, but not diminishing her essential beauty. And his body had changed too. Broader, more solid, marked by a scar on his shoulder she didn't remember, hair on his chest now silver like the hair on his head. But he was still fundamentally James, still the body her body remembered, and when they finally came together, skin against skin, with nothing between them, Catherine felt something shift inside her that had been locked in place for 35 years. Making love was different than it had been when they were young. Slower, more intentional, less frantic, despite the urgency of decades of separation. They took time to relearn each other, to discover how touch preferences had changed or stayed the same, to find the rhythm that worked for these bodies rather than trying to replicate what had worked for younger versions of themselves. But the connection was identical. That same sense of two people becoming one consciousness, experiencing itself through two perspectives. That same feeling that this was right in a way nothing else had ever been right. James touched her with the kind of attention that made Catherine understand why she'd never felt truly satisfied with anyone else. He paid attention to her responses, adjusted pressure and rhythm based on her sounds and movements, made her pleasure his primary focus in ways that felt both generous and selfish. Generous because he clearly wanted her satisfied. Selfish because her pleasure clearly turned him on in ways that were obvious and gratifying. And when Catherine finally came apart in his arms, her body remembering this, even if her mind had tried to forget, she cried again. Not from sadness, but from relief, from joy, from the overwhelming realization that some things really were worth waiting for, that love like theirs really could survive 3.5 decades of separation and still burn bright enough to consume everything in its path. Afterward, they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like James's laundry detergent, both catching their breath, both stunned by the intensity of what they'd just experienced, both understanding without needing to say it, that this changed everything. Catherine traced the scar on James's shoulder with gentle fingers, asking without words what had happened. And he told her quietly about a car accident 5 years ago, about how he'd walked away with nothing but this mark, and a renewed understanding that life was fragile, that waiting for the perfect moment meant you might wait forever, that sometimes you had to take risks, even when the timing seemed wrong. They talked for hours there in his bed, making love again when talking turned into touching, then talking more. The conversations that had been interrupted 35 years ago finally getting to continue. James told her about his mother's illness in detail, the diagnosis, the treatment, the years of care, the eventual peaceful death. Catherine told him about her marriage to David with the kind of honesty she'd never been able to give while David was alive, about loving him genuinely, while also always feeling like something was missing, always carrying this James-shaped hole in her heart that she'd tried to fill with other things, and failed. But mostly they marveled at the fact that they were together again, that the connection hadn't faded, that if anything it was stronger now because they understood how rare it was, how most people searched their entire lives for what they'd found at 19 and lost at 22, and somehow, miraculously, found again at 54. As evening fell on Boston and James's bedroom filled with shadows, Catherine understood something fundamental. She'd spent 35 years convinced that letting James go had been losing him. But lying in his arms, their bodies still humming with the afterglow of reunion, she realized the truth was more complex. They'd never really let each other go. They'd just been carrying each other quietly, waiting for the right moment to try again, trusting that love this powerful couldn't stay buried forever, that eventually, if they were patient enough and brave enough, fate or chance or whatever force governed such things would give them another opportunity. And here it was, their second chance, their opportunity to build the life they should have built decades ago, to see if passion this intense could be sustained not just for a summer or a year, but for whatever time they had left. The future was uncertain, logistics complicated. But lying in James's arms with Boston's September twilight painting the room in shades of amber and gold, Catherine decided that uncertainty was acceptable, that risk was worthwhile, that some loves were worth fighting for even when every practical consideration suggested caution. They'd waited 35 years. They could figure out the details. What mattered was this: they'd found each other again. The connection was real, and whatever came next, they would face it together rather than apart, finally learning the lesson they should have learned at 22. That love like theirs didn't come with guarantees or perfect timing. It only came with the demand that you be brave enough to claim it when offered the chance. Catherine stayed in Boston for 5 days that first visit. 5 days that felt simultaneously like an eternity, and like no time at all. 5 days during which she and James existed in a bubble of reunion that required acknowledging eventually, but that they both wanted to preserve as long as possible. They made love repeatedly, unable to keep their hands off each other, making up for 35 years of celibacy, not physical celibacy, but the celibacy that came from never quite feeling complete with anyone else, from always holding something back, from going through motions without the soul deep connection that made physical intimacy transcendent rather than just pleasurable. But they also talked endlessly, filling in the gaps of 3.5 decades, learning each other as adults the way they'd once learned each other as near children. James told Catherine about his career in detail she hadn't asked for but found fascinating anyway. The deals he'd brokered, the risks he'd taken, the way finance had satisfied his need for precision and strategy, even though it had never touched his soul the way Catherine had always touched it. Catherine told James about teaching, about the students who'd become like surrogate children, about the particular joy of watching young people fall in love with literature, about how poetry had sustained her through the loneliest years by giving her a language for feelings she couldn't otherwise express. They cooked together in James's kitchen, and Catherine discovered he'd become an excellent cook during his bachelor years, something that hadn't been true when they were young. They walked through Boston's autumn streets, holding hands like the college students they'd once been, revisiting places that held memories, the library where they'd met, though it had been renovated beyond recognition, the coffee shop where they'd spent hours talking, now a boutique selling overpriced clothes, the tiny apartment James had shared with 3 roommates, now part of a luxury development that made Catherine angry on behalf of their younger selves who'd never have been able to afford living there now. But mostly, they existed in James's apartment, in his bedroom specifically, learning each other's bodies with the kind of attention that came from understanding how rare this was, how most people never experienced chemistry this powerful, how they'd been given a second chance that most people only dreamed about. Catherine discovered that James's appetite for her hadn't diminished with age. If anything, it had intensified, as if 35 years of deprivation had created a hunger that required constant feeding, constant reassurance that she was real and present and his to touch. And her desire for him was equally consuming, equally insatiable, her body responding to his touch like it was 19 again, like nerve endings that had been dormant for decades were suddenly firing with the kind of intensity that made her feel alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. They explored each other thoroughly, discovering how preferences had shifted or stayed the same, finding new ways to give each other pleasure while also revisiting the ways that had always worked, building a sexual vocabulary that incorporated both past and present, memory and innovation. On the 4th night, lying in bed after making love with an intensity that had left them both shaking and breathless, James asked Catherine something that made her chest tighten with emotion. He asked if she'd brought the letters with her, if they were in her bag, if he could see them again, read them alongside her, remember together what they'd been to each other before life had intervened and separated them. Catherine retrieved the box from her carry-on, and they spent hours reading through the correspondence, taking turns, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes silently, both crying and laughing at the intensity of their younger selves, at the certainty they'd had about forever, at the explicit descriptions of desire that still made Catherine blush even after the physical intimacy they'd been sharing for days. But reading the letters together created something new, a bridge between past and present, a way of honoring who they'd been while also celebrating who they'd become. James pulled out his own box of letters then, the ones Catherine had written him, and seeing her 19-year-old handwriting expressing desire and devotion in equal measure made her understand something profound. They'd both been carrying each other all these years, both been unable to let go, both been waiting without knowing they were waiting for exactly this moment, when they were old enough to understand what they had, mature enough to fight for it, brave enough to risk everything for the chance to be together. They decided that night, lying in bed surrounded by evidence of young love that had survived against all odds, that they weren't going to waste any more time. Catherine would go back to Charleston to handle her responsibilities, her mother's estate, her daughter's wedding planning, the semester she'd committed to teaching. But then she would move to Boston, would leave Charleston and the life she'd built there, would choose love over geography, would finally prioritize them over everything else. The decision should have felt rushed or reckless, but it didn't. It felt inevitable, like they were finally doing what they should have done 35 years ago, like they were correcting a mistake that had cost them decades of happiness. James offered to move to Charleston instead, to be the one who relocated, but Catherine refused. She'd lived in Charleston her entire life except for college, and while she loved the city, it held memories of David, of her marriage, of a life built around someone else. Boston was where she and James had begun, where they'd fallen in love, where they belonged together. Her daughter took the news about as well as could be expected. Confusion mixed with concern, mixed with grudging happiness that her mother had found someone. Catherine told her an edited version of the truth, about James being a college boyfriend she'd reconnected with, about realizing they still had feelings for each other, about deciding at 54 that life was too short to not pursue happiness when it presented itself. She didn't mention the letters, or the intensity of their physical connection, or the fact that she'd never stopped loving him through her entire marriage. Some truths were too private, too sacred to share even with her children. The 3 months between that first Boston visit and Catherine's permanent move were simultaneously torturous and exhilarating. They talked every day, video calls that lasted hours, phone conversations that stretched into the early morning, text messages that ranged from practical logistics to explicit descriptions of what they wanted to do to each other when they were finally together permanently. And they wrote letters, actual physical letters sent through the mail, creating new correspondence to sit alongside the old, documenting this reunion the way they documented their original relationship. Catherine's letters to James during those 3 months were different from her 19-year-old letters, but no less passionate. She wrote about the peculiar torture of knowing exactly what she was missing, of her body remembering his touch with such specificity that ordinary life felt flat and colorless by comparison. She wrote about lying in bed touching herself, while remembering the ways he'd touched her, about how inadequate her own hands felt compared to his, about how she'd become that person who counted days and hours until reunion like a teenager, rather than a 54-year-old woman who should know better. But she also wrote about hope, about feeling alive for the first time in decades, about understanding finally that the restlessness she'd carried through her marriage hadn't been dissatisfaction with David, but recognition that something essential was missing, that she'd been built to fit with James specifically, and spending life with anyone else would always feel slightly wrong, slightly incomplete, no matter how good or kind or adequate they were. James's letters back were equally passionate, equally explicit, equally devoted. He wrote about preparing his home for her arrival, about clearing closet space and drawer space, but also about how those practical preparations felt insufficient for what he was really doing, which was preparing his entire life to finally include the person who should have been there all along. He wrote about desire that felt both familiar and new, about how wanting her at 54 felt more intense than wanting her at 22, because now he understood how rare this was, how most people search their entire lives without finding chemistry this powerful. But he also wrote about fear, about being terrified that something would go wrong, that she'd change her mind, that fate or chance or whatever force had separated them before would intervene again. He wrote about feeling like he was holding his breath, waiting for her to actually arrive, not quite believing this was real, until she was physically present in his space, in his life, in his bed where she belonged. Her daughter's wedding came and went, beautiful and joyful, and Catherine cried, watching her walk down the aisle, cried at the vows, cried during the reception, overcome with emotion that was part happiness for her daughter and part grief for all the years she'd wasted not being brave enough to reach for what she wanted. But mostly she cried with gratitude that she was getting a second chance, that she'd found James again before it was too late, that whatever time they had left would be spent together rather than apart. 2 weeks after the wedding, Catherine loaded her most precious possessions into her car: books, photographs, her grandmother's china, and the box of letters that had started everything, and drove north toward Boston, toward James, toward the life they should have been living all along. The drive took 12 hours, and she spent them alternating between excitement and terror, between certainty that this was right and panic that she was making a terrible mistake, between feeling 19 and reckless and feeling 54 and reckless. Unsure which was more appropriate, but knowing it didn't matter because she was doing this regardless. James was waiting for her when she arrived, standing on the sidewalk in front of his building like he'd been unable to wait inside, and the sight of him made Catherine's heart do something acrobatic in her chest, made her understand that this feeling, this specific combination of desire and devotion and absolute certainty, was what she'd been missing for 35 years, what she'd been searching for in all the wrong places, what she'd finally found again. They stood on that Boston sidewalk holding each other while cars passed and pedestrians navigated around them, and the city moved at its typical frantic pace. But Catherine and James existed in their own timeline, their own bubble, finally together permanently, after decades of separation. And when they finally pulled apart enough to look at each other, both crying and laughing simultaneously, James said something that made Catherine's breath catch. He told her he had something for her, something he'd been saving for 35 years, something he'd bought when he was 22 and stupid enough to think timing mattered more than love. And he pulled from his pocket a small jewelry box that Catherine recognized immediately. The same box she'd found at the bottom of her mother's attic. The ring he'd bought but never given her. The proposal that had never happened because he'd decided for both of them that separation was kinder than struggling together. James opened the box, and the ring was exactly as Catherine remembered. Simple, elegant, a single diamond on a platinum band, beautiful in its understated perfection. And then he asked her the question he should have asked 35 years ago, the question that would have changed everything if he'd had the courage to ask it then. He asked if she would marry him, if she would finally let him make permanent what had always been true, that they belonged together, that they were meant for each other, that some loves were strong enough to survive decades of separation and still burn bright when given the chance to live again. Catherine said yes before he finished asking, yes through tears and laughter, yes with her whole body and heart and soul, yes to everything. The ring, the proposal, the life they would build, the time they would share, all of it. Everything. Finally saying yes to what she should have been allowed to say yes to decades ago if James had trusted her enough to let her make her own choice. They were married 6 weeks later in a quiet ceremony at Boston's Public Garden, the same park where they'd spent countless afternoons as college students, where they'd first said "I love you," where they'd kissed under trees that were older than them and would likely outlive them, creating permanence in a place that had witnessed the beginning of their love story, and now witnessed what they hoped was the true beginning, the one that would last until death, rather than just until circumstance intervened. Catherine's children attended with various levels of enthusiasm and confusion, still processing their mother's whirlwind romance and relocation. But James's sister spoke at the ceremony about watching him be half alive for 35 years, about how finding Catherine again had brought him back to full living, about how love like theirs deserved celebration rather than caution or judgment. And standing there in autumn sun with James's ring on her finger and their history written in letters they'd saved and new memories they were creating, Catherine understood something fundamental about love and timing and second chances. They'd lost 35 years, yes, but those years hadn't been wasted. They'd been preparation, education, the price they'd paid for understanding how rare what they had was, how most people searched lifetimes without finding chemistry this powerful, connection this deep, love this consuming. And maybe they wouldn't have appreciated it at 22 the way they appreciated it at 54. Maybe they'd needed to live other lives, love other people, experience loss and grief, and the particular loneliness that came from never quite fitting with anyone else, in order to understand what they had when they found each other again. Their wedding night was spent in James's apartment, now Catherine's apartment too, now the home they would build together with whatever time remained. They made love with the desperate passion of people who'd waited decades for permission to stop holding back, who'd finally learned that love like theirs didn't come with guarantees about tomorrow, but only with demands about today. That you show up, that you choose each other, that you love as hard and completely as you're capable of loving, regardless of how much time you have left to love in. But afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that now belonged to both of them, James gave Catherine one more gift, a leather journal, beautiful and expensive, empty pages waiting to be filled. He told her he wanted them to write their own letters now, new ones, documenting this reunion, this second chance, this life they were finally building. Not letters sent through mail or stored in boxes, but letters written to each other and shared immediately, read aloud in bed, creating intimacy through words the way they'd always done, honoring the correspondence that had sustained them through separation by continuing it into togetherness. Catherine opened the journal and found James had already written the first entry, a letter dated that day, their wedding day, telling her everything he felt, everything he'd been holding inside for 35 years, everything he wanted their future to hold. His words were poetry and pornography and devotion and desire all woven together, exactly like the letters he'd written when he was young, but deeper now, richer now, weighted with understanding of how precious and fragile and powerful love like theirs was. She wrote back immediately, her entry following his, telling him about the terror and exhilaration of choosing him, of leaving everything familiar to build something new, of trusting that love this powerful was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any leap of faith required. She wrote about her body's memory of his touch, about how desire hadn't faded but had only grown stronger with understanding of its rarity, about how she intended to spend whatever time they had left, making up for time lost, loving him as completely and explicitly as she was capable of loving. They passed the journal back and forth over the weeks and months that followed, filling it with words that ranged from practical observations about daily life to explicit descriptions of what they'd done to each other the night before, from philosophical musings about love and time to mundane complaints about Boston winter, creating a document of their life together that was both beautiful and profane, both elevated and earthly, both sacred and explicit. Exactly like their love had always been, Catherine's life in Boston took shape gradually. She found teaching work at a local university, made friends with James's friends who became her friends, learned to navigate the city as a resident rather than a visitor. But mostly she reveled in the simple fact of not being alone anymore, of having someone to share morning coffee with, and evening wine with, and midnight conversations with when sleep proved elusive. She reveled in the physical intimacy that remained as powerful months into their reunion as it had been at first, their bodies still insatiable for each other in ways that felt both age-appropriate and entirely not, chemistry that apparently had no expiration date. James proposed they burn the old letters, suggested it might be cathartic to release the past, to let go of the documentation of youth in favor of embracing present. But Catherine refused, argued that those letters were evidence of something important, that love like theirs could survive anything, even decades of separation, even choices that seemed final, even the accumulated weight of time and distance and lives lived separately. Those letters were proof that what they'd found at 19 was real and powerful enough to sustain through 35 years of absence, and she wanted to keep them, wanted to be able to look at them when she was 80, and remember that she'd loved this man at 19 and 54, and every age in between, even when they were apart. So the old letters stayed in their box, stored now in their shared closet, occasionally pulled out on anniversaries, or when nostalgia struck, read aloud to each other as reminder of who they'd been and how far they'd traveled to get back to each other. But the new journal, the one they wrote in together, that lived on their nightstand, pages filling with their present tense love story, proof that some romances didn't end with the first kiss, or the wedding, or even decades of separation, but only ended when hearts stopped beating, and even then, maybe not even then. Maybe love this powerful found ways to persist beyond the boundaries of physical existence, written into the universe the way they'd written it into letters, permanent and indestructible and absolutely real. 2 years after their reunion, Catherine woke in their bed on a Saturday morning and lay there watching James sleep, his face soft in ways it never was when awake, his breathing deep and steady, his body warm against hers under blankets that smelled like them both now, like their shared life, like home. And she understood with absolute clarity that this exact moment, was worth every lonely year that preceded it, every night she'd slept alone, every moment she'd wondered if she'd made a mistake marrying David, every second of longing and regret, and missing someone she thought she'd never see again. Because this was the life she was supposed to be living. This specific man. This specific love. This specific chemistry that made her body respond like she was 22, even though the mirror showed her otherwise. This was what the letters had promised, what they'd documented, what they'd preserved through decades of separation. Evidence that love like theirs existed, that it was real, that it was worth waiting for no matter how long the wait required. James woke to find her watching him, pulled her close, kissed her with morning breath and bed-warm skin and complete acceptance of bodies that were older but no less desirable, no less capable of pleasure, no less hungry for connection. And as morning light filled their bedroom, and Boston woke outside their windows, and they made love with the comfortable passion of people who knew each other completely, Catherine thought about the box in the closet, about letters written in youth and preserved through decades, about how some loves really were worth waiting half a lifetime for, about how the best love stories didn't always follow conventional timelines, but sometimes required patience and pain and decades of separation before reaching their proper ending. Love letters that time couldn't erase. Not because they were written in permanent ink or stored carefully in boxes, but because they were written in bodies that remembered, in hearts that never stopped carrying each other, in souls that recognized their match and refused to settle for anything less, even when separation seemed permanent and reunion impossible. That was the real magic. Catherine thought, not the letters themselves, but what they represented. Evidence that some loves burn so bright they leave permanent marks, scars, and shadows that time can't heal because they're not meant to be healed, only honored, only remembered, only claimed again when given the chance. And they'd been given the chance. They'd found each other again, had built the life they should have built decades earlier, had learned that waiting didn't diminish desire but only intensified it, had discovered that love measured in letters and memories and decades of longing was love worth celebrating, worth fighting for, worth building a life around no matter how much time had been lost or how much time remained. In their shared journal that night, Catherine wrote about that morning, about watching James sleep, about understanding that this was her real life, the one she was meant to be living. And James wrote back, his entry following hers, about waking to find her watching him, about feeling like the luckiest man alive, about how love letters written in youth and preserved through decades had led them here, to this moment, to this life, to each other finally, permanently, completely, exactly as they'd always been meant to be. Did Catherine and James's story touch your heart? This journey reminds us that true passion doesn't fade. It simply waits for the courage to claim it again. That desire at 54 can burn just as hot as at 19, and that some loves are meant to be reignited, not just remembered. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a longing, or simply hope, Please leave a like and share it with someone who needs this reminder. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about love that transcends time.